Hello. The Airs for Architecture podcast's latest episode is a discussion with the architect, writer, teacher and broadcaster Piers Taylor. It is Piers' second time on the show, but rather than just talk about his practice, this time we discuss his freshly minted book, Learning from the Local, Designing Responsively for People, Climate and Culture, published by RIBA Publishing in October. In Learning from the Local, Piers presents global examples of low-carbon, context-responsive architecture. In arguing for a post-global design practice, examining geology, waste, ecology, self-building community engagement, Piers proposes something like a vernacular, as LL Cool J almost said. We talk this, Oz, practice, good practice, and a very elegant proposal for what Piers calls restless innovation that's well lush.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm talking today to Piers Taylor. Piers, thank you for being with me again. We're going to be talking about your very recently published book, Learning from the Local, Designing Responsively for People, Climate and Culture, which came out with RIBA Publishing, this year, but very recently, wasn't it?
I think actually today, I think it's the 1st of October, it came out, and so hot off the press.
Hot off the press, and you've been down under promoting it.
Yeah, I actually had to take 10 copies in my luggage to Australia, 10 advance copies, because I was there for something else, and as part of being there, there's a local bookshop that asked me to do something. So did a talk when I was there about these issues, and curiously, that's, I guess, where a lot of my journey into this stuff began, 35 years ago or something.
Yes, that was with Oro Publications, wasn't it? You were down there.
That was with Oro, who are great. That's right. Yeah.
But you were also there to meet a hero of mine, and I think a hero of yours.
Well, a hero of many architects, actually. And of course, he's a hero of mine. I'd hoped that I'd grown out of having heroes into, or perhaps evolved into them being mentors. But Glenn is and was a hero and is and was a mentor because, I studied with him 35 years ago and I stayed in touch over the years, done various things with him. And in a way, he's redirected my life several times. I mean, not personally, I guess, but more just in terms of what his model of practice and his way of seeing sort of design issues, where that sort of led me. And, most critically, I think 2001, I had graduated here. So I'd gone to Australia to study, came back here in, mid-90s, did a part 2 here. And I can't remember whether I've talked to you about this before, but when I studied here, I was interested in the same sort of things that Glenn had exposed me to, which were local concerns, wind, water, place, sunlight, just what those things were, not necessarily what they meant, just what they were. And when I came back here, and I remember asking my tutors at the AA about that stuff, they just said, there's none of that stuff here. There's only the self-referential world of architecture. And also what they meant, it was only 9 degrees and drizzling. So, there isn't that extreme of stuff that you can get excited about. But I was excited about it, but I sort of lost my way a bit. And in 2001, I went back to study again with Glenn and did the inaugural Glenn Murcutt Masterclass, where we stayed for 2 weeks in one of his buildings that was a residential centre called the Arthur Boyd Centre down about 2 hours south of Sydney, where Arthur Boyd, the artist who was sort of Anglo-Australian, had lived. And it's an extraordinary building and it's an extraordinary model of learning. And that kind of redirected me, and I came back and I bought the place that we still live in. And then again, subsequently, I mean, he came over here for various things. I've been over there for various things. But critically, in 2011, I think I went back, 2010, 2011, and spent 6 weeks there in Sydney, just north of Sydney, where he and someone called Richard de Plastrier live, and realized I couldn't go back to my previous life, and I'm sure I've talked about that before. But again, Glenn provided a kind of a roadmap for a model of practice that wasn't quite so beholden to the sort of concerns of, I guess, dare I say, professional practice, commercial practice that is the familiar model in this country.
Why do you think it is that Australia produces this form of deeply embedded? I did a podcast with Terroir, with Gerard Reinmuth and
Yeah.
Scott Baumfuth, and I've done others with Australian architects. And then obviously, there's Peter Stutchbury, who I got in contact with following a link, I think, on your Instagram or some kind of mention on your Instagram, which I'm very excited to say I finally managed to secure. Why do you think it is that that part of the world seems to have this greater ease with that form of, and of course northern Europe as well, more northern Europe than Britain?
It's partly, I think, the product of our procurement culture here. So, in this country, it's really hard to win interesting work if you are a small, agile practice. Really, really hard. I mean, we grew up, I guess, as architects being, sold the story that you could be a student like Richard Rogers and you could win the Pompidou Centre, that kind of brilliant rock star model where just through your genius you could do something and, you could be held together if you needed by someone like Arabs who could provide an external sort of framework around you. But fundamentally, that hardly exists here. And most buildings are procured through frameworks, which means that you have to prove you have a lot of professional indemnity insurance, but also you have to prove that you've done a certain type of building before, probably 3 of them in the last 5 years, and whereas actually all buildings have, light and air to a certain degree and enclosure and whatever else. And actually you don't need to have done a gallery to do a gallery and, anything but. But internationally, that model of procurement doesn't exist and certainly hasn't held Peter Stutchbury back from doing bigger projects. I was there with him last week and he's working on, projects that are 40 million with a very small office. And, again, I think that there's something about the orthodox model of practice here that also perhaps just goes beyond the need to be of a certain size. There's something kind of, I think, sort of institutional in the way that we build frameworks around us in order to practice. And, even when I had a proper practice, I wasn't really interested in that sort of institutional structure. I just wanted to make buildings really. And I think I didn't want to be invested with the sort of, systems that you needed around you to, hire people or whatever it was. And that wasn't because I wasn't interested in people. In fact, I think I was so interested in people, I wanted to kind of collaborate with them as equals. I didn't want to necessarily deal with the kind of superficial things of their, day-to-day sort of welfare. And somehow in Northern Europe, they managed to work on much larger projects as sort of amalgamations of smaller practices. And there's something in Australia that still is, I guess, that sort of lone model of practice that does sort of endure. And Glenn is the best example of that. I mean, I think, he's 89. And so for 60 years, I would argue, he's sort of demonstrated that actually it is possible to take on really big themes, really big issues that exist in the world, at a global scale, and yet work in a very place-specific way with a very modest building in some ways. So in a way, there's something that isn't limiting about small practice there, as in small practice, as in, the institution, but also the scale of the project can deal with big themes. Here, power and money dominates, and also sort of institutional thinking dominates.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting answer, and perhaps not the one I was expecting, which was going to be something to do with, I don't know, climate and the depth of sort of, well, I suppose the closeness of folk to their place and space and the language of their cultures, the indigenous culture particularly.
That too, I think. And yet, I think in order, what I don't want to do is diminish certain practices in this country, because I still think there is a real interest here, and this is in the UK, in the kind of grassroots culture of people getting together to kind of initiate and make stuff. And, of course, Lee Ivett is a very good example of that, who used to be, I think, your business partner and is a friend of both of ours. And in a way, Lee's not unusual here. There's a lineage of those kind of practices here, Lee and Assemble and, material cultures, whoever it is. And in Australia, curiously, that doesn't exist. So when I was there recently, the question that almost everyone asked, whenever I do a talk was, how can we do that kind of stuff here? The stuff that Lee does, the kind of stuff that I've done historically, Studio in the Woods or community-based projects that evolve, over time in places like East Key or whatever it is. There's still the kind of very strong hold that power and money has over architecture there. So it's not all good at all. However, there's something that the landscape has there that is very, very different. There's a kind of there's space, huge amount of space. And there's sort of, an extreme thing that you have to, it's not 9 degrees and drizzling. You have to respond to it. You need something that does force you to act somehow. And maybe, as you sort of infer, that's sort of part of it.
The book, Learning from the Local,
Mm.
where does that come from in your own work? What point do you find yourself, and why this book now? Because it feels sort of manifesto-ish.
Well, it's not a manifesto, actually. I think that it's not topical, but a manifesto, I would argue, presents a kind of, singular position. Whereas I've always liked complexity and I've always liked contradiction and I've always liked the sort of tussle of negotiating conflicting ideas. And I don't like simplistic solutions or things that seem too easy. And I think one of the most enduring things about architecture and why architecture endures as a vehicle that is, perpetually interesting is that it's really complex. It's a shifting target and it has to deal with such a kind of broad section of stuff where things don't want to be reconciled. It's almost impossible to reconcile things within architecture. Mm-hmm. And if you think you're reconciling something, to do with culture, people, climate, place, program, money, whatever, and also a kind of theoretical position about how you might work in a particular way, actually, you're deluded, I think. So where the book came from was, I guess, a 35-year journey that began with the world that Murcutt showed me, which was an incredibly direct response to place. He just looked at places and, in a way, you could argue, built what those places demanded. There was no romance, and I loved that there was no romance. There was no sort of nostalgia. Nothing was framed in vernacular terms. There was just a kind of direct response to a series of places. And I think when I came back here, I think I probably was surprised by the sort of stranglehold that vernacular referencing had over architecture as somehow something that couldn't even be challenged or negotiated. It was sort of, belonging to a place meant that you had to reference something materially that existed or came to exist within a very narrow window in human history. I don't mean the material itself. I mean materially as in, the building forms that were made from certain materials, And, so for example, where I live in Bath, buildings are made out of limestone, and the built infrastructure in some senses, just north of Bath actually, have really only come into being in, a period of human history between, say, 1750 and, 1880 or something like that. A very, very narrow window in human history. And yet that is the default sort of a priori framework that we are, in a way, sort of supposed somehow to respond to, relate to, and reference. And even those words, respond, relate, reference, are things that I, have become increasingly uncomfortable about. And, certainly historically, I didn't really understand why, I found it so sort of, diminishing to have to use those terms. But more and more and more, I think I kind of do. And actually, could weave Glenn back into this, because I remember driving through the Cotswolds, having picked him up from an old college friend of his, maybe, 30 or 40 miles north of here, and drove him down through the Cotswolds to where I am, the southern tip of the Cotswolds, 3 miles north of Bath. And I remember him saying, what happened. This was a place I came to, in the 60s or early 60s, 1963, I think. And it was astonishingly influential for him in terms of showing him how you could, evolve a very direct architecture out of material constraint, which was just where stuff came from, and you made everything out of that material. There was a kind of material continuity that was just based around the kind of relational systems of what you had and what you could make. And what we saw, of course, when he came back, was people, taking a concrete block, dipping it in stone dust, and suggesting if we did that and gave it a pitch roof, that was belonging. And I think also then, it isn't just led by planners. I think even within the kind of discourse of architecture, there's a sort of neo-vernacular thing, that I've never quite understood, from Tesco's brown roofs, the Tesco brown roof vernacular that supermarkets were made from for a period of kind of 20 years, from about 1980 until about, maybe late 90s. Apart from actually some fantastic high tech ones, those things were just sort of confusing. And then also, I think there's lots of things. I mean, globally, I guess I'm not from anywhere, I'm not from a place. And I think this whole notion of culturally belonging is a sort of really interesting question. At what point do you belong? At what point culturally do you have a voice somewhere if you weren't born there? So my parents weren't born here. Neither of them had British passports. And yet, ostensibly they were British. And yet, do they belong? Did they belong? They weren't born here. Some people would argue they should go back to where they came from, but they didn't really come from anywhere. And, equivalently, I've lived in other places, and I've lived in places where my parents were born. Does that make me allowed to be there? Do I have a voice there? And of course, this is speaking from a position of acute middle class privilege. But of course, we follow that through and look at what's happening now with this huge concern about migration, that I don't again understand the concern. What is that about? What's that challenging? And in a way, I also became concerned politically that any conversation around the local had been claimed by right-wing nationalists as their own and bound up in some abstract concern about nationhood that came out of an arbitrary border that, historically has kind of constantly shifted. Even our own island is something that's been constantly shifting. 20,000 years ago, it was attached to France. It wasn't an island. Now it happens that it is. But those borders, what do they mean? And, it's such an interesting world, really. And of course, right now we're in the midst of even Trump revisiting this stuff. I mean, he has a different agenda than I do, but he's, I would say, leading a global discourse around what does it mean to be local and what does that mean? So, of course, I want to just reinforce that I very much do have a different agenda to Donald Trump on every level. And I'm not really interested in what the border of a country means. What I have become increasingly interested in, what territory is that then? Because again, I also am bored by the kind of, abstract 5 kilometer, 2 kilometer, 1 kilometer, 50-mile things that are new kind of approaches to localism. So that's where some of that stuff comes from.
There's a lot going on, and it's very interesting. But it doesn't come across, of course, in any way as a book about politics, but is a book about architecture.
Well, it's published by the RIBA, and I think when I veered occasionally into politics, they would go, maybe that's a different book. So maybe that's to come.
Yeah, it does strike me as your book is part of a growing trend towards the repoliticization of architectural thinking, which is in a way to talk about it as the re-socialization of architecture. I mean, I think socialization is a more productive and more generous way of thinking about it. Politics being something that brings most people out in hives these days. But the re-socialization of architecture, which is something to do with re-embedding it
in places.
Well, in places, but also in the realm of necessity. Like, it has to be good.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that millennium period of shape making and fun did seem to me to be kind of unserious as well.
Exactly. And I think, also since then, since the millennium, we've had the rise of social media, where there's the kind of aestheticization of everything, and there's the kind of imagization of everything that's led by various online platforms that present architecture as the singular sort of image without substance. The book has come out of practice rather than theory and rather than academia. And I think that the thing that's happened in my own lifetime has been, my own working life has been a drift away from architecture as a kind of civic duty, where historically 50% of architects worked in, local authorities and were concerned with the construction of civic infrastructure. Now that's something like 0.3%. And what that's meant, I think, for younger practitioners is that they've become increasingly sort of unhappy with the agency of architecture, the stuff that architecture can do, because, of course, nowadays it is almost always beholden to, the institutions of power and money. And I think there's something about reclaiming that narrative that has become essential for many architects, particularly in this country. And, I would argue that now in this country, if you're not concerned with trying to reclaim or reposition the agency of architecture as something that can sit outside the frameworks of money and power, you're in the minority. I would argue that almost every small practice is interested in those things because, again, it's incredibly potent, but also we can see the need for it. We can see the sheer need for architecture to act in places where those places, again, in that same period, have changed, I guess, beyond recognition. So in that same period, 30, 40 years, whatever it is, places have gone from places that had a kind of civic pride and a kind of civic identity into places that have had all the industry taken away, all of the belonging that came from those industrial processes. I mean, industrial in the broadest sense of the word, of things that were produced and made, that gave places identities and infrastructure. All of that has gone. And nobody politically gave it a moment's thought to what could exist in its place. So almost all those small towns have been decimated in this country by the removal of industry and the replacement with, pound land shops and also then jobs that either don't exist, or if they do, they're low skill, low grade jobs that give you no sense of, civic pride. So that the sheer need of architecture, I would argue, the demand for architecture to make change is incredibly high. And it's something that many people are interested in.
Yes, I think one of the strategies that's been developed in architecture and part of this millennium period style has been to plonk down a kind of universalist art gallery, cultural centre kind of space.
Yeah. Ploppism is literally the word we use, Ambrose. When we did East Quay, which is a cultural centre in a marginalised community in the southwest of England, the word that my client used, who are called the Onion Collective, was ploppism, as in, we look at some very good buildings, we look at, I would argue, Turner Contemporary in Margate it's a very good building, but it's an example of ploppism, where you plop down some high culture divorced from its context and you expect somehow that to make a change in a place because you've invested lots of money in it. But actually that's just dropping something in. It isn't drawing something out of the relational networks of a place that actually work with, the sort of material processes, the people, the kind of cultural eddies, the new sort of grassroots infrastructures that can develop into ecosystems that present new belongings, and I'm afraid I don't know much about the Turner Contemporary, so perhaps I've got that wrong. But fundamentally, ploppism is something that did evolve as a way of solving things after, I guess, probably about the millennium, not terribly successfully.
I mean, how do you do this? How do you then, to get into, I guess, the work of Invisible Studio, but hopefully also, as you've written about it in your book, how do you get into this learning from the local? What are the processes an architect needs to engage with that go beyond the kind of ideated diagram and kind of some path? A little cheeky some path and a bit of demographic data. I mean,
so I'm really interested in the idea of a locality as a kind of active process that embeds architecture in networks that you have to understand. So for example, in my teaching with my students, the first piece of work they do is to really understand the territory within which they're working that labels don't give them. So if we're working in a town, I'm working in a town called Melksham this year, that doesn't tell us anything. The kind of boundary around that that's drawn by a local authority means nothing. What I'm interested in is understanding the territory through a different lens, which is, what is that exists around this place that did support it once, doesn't support it now, that could support it in the future, and then over what radius, what sort of, where is this stuff that then exists that we could draw on, that means that we could develop a new set of systems that sit within that. And that's such an important idea for me because if I look at some of the research projects that I'm doing that are in, small settlements in Southern Europe, in fact, there's a set of spaces and places that if you look through a vernacular lens or even look through, I would argue a critical regionalist lens, what you would see is a set of buildings that you would reference and a set of materials that would use. What you wouldn't look at is the set of customs and infrastructures and relationships and processes that gave rise to those type of spatial configurations. So the question then is, what type of new relational networks do we draw on to establish a new set of infrastructures that will look different from these, but ultimately will provide a same kind of understanding of locality through those sort of active processes, not the kind of surface representations that I would argue that people like Kenneth Frampton or other people who have written about this field, Tsonis and Lefebvre and so on, they are super interesting. But there's a cultural narrative there that I think they're too embedded in, rather than things like participation and governance and temporal incompleteness or pluralism over synthesis, whatever it kind of is. And so, my book tries very gently, without it being a manifesto, to reframe, this idea of the local as a relational phenomenon, one that relates to social, ecological, temporal, and political networks.
That's very good. You've mentioned critical regionalism, you've mentioned Lefebvre and Tsonis, you've mentioned Frampton, and you've mentioned pluralism. So this is perhaps a slightly silly question, but what would you say would be the philosophical heart of the project, of the book, sorry? Where does it find its main driver?
To a certain degree, I think it finds it in the grit of practice. But actually, because as a practitioner, I have tussled with these things over decades, which is, again, if I am to work somewhere, how do I belong there? And when I work here, where I am now, I've been here for nearly 30 years, and there is a set of networks that I've come to understand, and I can draw on those in a very tacit manner. And we did a project in Greece recently, and again, there's a similar set of networks that I can draw on in a kind of tacit way through the kind of grit of practice, through known things. And I've tried in a way to work in other places, and without those, and it's been perhaps less interesting. I went to Australia, as you pointed out recently, and Francis Carey did a very interesting talk about his work in Burkina Faso and Africa. And the question many people had is, well, now he's working in Las Vegas. How do you do work that actually has an equivalent sort of meaning? And all of those tussles aren't new, because, of course, there's also the heroic nature of universal modelism that is super sort of seductive, and I am interested in that sense of universality and anything can be anywhere, but at the same time, there is this sense that places are really interesting, and yet we don't really understand, because of all the stuff we talked about at the beginning of this, the new vernacularists or, political right-wing frameworks, we don't understand how to draw on them in ways that go beyond the kind of superficial or the tokenistic or, the exclusive, as in excluding, certain people and things and ideas. So I think, to answer your question, actually, I think, theoretically, it does draw on critical regionalism and those ideas. But that was, I think, written in about 1983. And in a way, I think the premises of that book were really, really interesting because, there was something within Frampton that resisted something about, the homogenizing nature of, universal modernism. But I think at the same time, I would argue that his attention to, topography, climate, light, and tectonic form, things that were kind of explicitly architectural, were, I say, limiting not in a pejorative sense, but mainly concerned with, capital A architecture. And I think that there's something that I'm interested in, which is a messier, looser process that actually allows us to, um, draw on something that's kind of contested or negotiated or even socially constructed. And I think Susanna Hagen at the Bartlett has written a little bit about this. And I think that the problem also with critical regionalism is not Frampton's, it's the interpretation of it by many architects who think it's a kind of way of, somehow unthinkingly belonging is to kind of, this thing that we talked about, to signal localness, without what I'm interested in doing, which is embedding projects in the kind of lived and embodied and, relational realities of a place.
How do you spatialize this? Like, I understand what you're saying, and words like network, bricolage, and assemblage, and there's a million of them. You go to any architecture conference, you can sort of play a sort of bingo where you can jot down these words beforehand and see if you can cross them off before you get to the first lunch break of hearing all of these words. And
yeah,
they're very seductive. But the job of the architect is to turn those values and those desires and those observations into
absolutely.
physical things that meet legal regulation in terms of accessibility and Part A and fire and life safety. How do you do this? And is there something
super interesting question?
Well, is there something particular about the way that you then engage with the client? Because particularly, say, for example, at East Quay, you have a hydra of a client. You have a client with loads of heads. And a hydra is probably a bit negative, but you have a polyphonous client. How do you then do this? And what role the architect in this space?
It's a really good question. I think the book also is about building. It's about things that, I really like buildings. And I think there's something within architecture that also resists, the idea of the built artifact as something that is interesting. Because, I remember even when I did my PhD, I remember, my supervisor kept saying, don't talk about the object, don't talk about the artifact. It's not about that. It's just about the kind of processes of emergence and governance and, all that kind of participatory stuff that I am interested in. And it was sort of, I remember I was going to do this talk once, and I framed it something like, it's not about the building, because of course I was embarrassed about talking about the building. And Charles Holland, and of course I'm sure called me out on it and said, buildings are super interesting. Of course, he's absolutely right that, this is also re-embracing the idea of a building as something that is incredibly interesting and incredibly potent. The question about what it should look like, I think, is a really interesting one. And I'll talk about two buildings. And again, there are buildings because, the buildings I know about. And East Quay is a piece of civic infrastructure that came out of 10 years of conversation with a group of people who were our clients and a wider group of people who were people who were cared about that place. They lived or worked or, were invested in this town. And we never knew what the building was going to be, and we didn't really know at the time what the building would look like, during all of these sort of conversations that we were having over many years about really, how could architecture act as a vehicle of change? What ecosystem of stuff would allow a sustainable business model to evolve? What should the building do in terms of connecting into, networks that were, sort of connections of footpaths and, networks that allowed people to be connected in the town and all of those kind of things. And out of that came an idea that was very strongly formed about what the building should do. And the place is interesting architecturally. And during the course of making or designing the building, I became increasingly aware that most places have no architectural concerns in terms of the completion of a, static object that is, as I'm sure and agree rather, is an idea that's an incredibly recent idea in, architectural history. Since the Renaissance, things have a clear lineage, clear starting point, and a clear set of transactions that allow it then to be completed and handed over and finalized. And recently, there's then the fixed idea of it in a photograph without people. And, I realized that there was no interest in that stuff. And buildings had no beginning, no end, and no authorship and no auteur. They were accrued over time by many, many people, in the best sense of, the true vernacular. And that became something that I thought was really, really interesting. And that wasn't necessarily a kind of stylistic thing, but it was more a kind of what I call a temporal openness. It's something that is sort of conceptually incomplete. And that's an idea rather than a kind of look, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's also, I guess, it's a horrible word, but it's also kind of something that can be aestheticized. But it increasingly I became aware the building had to be, loose, incomplete, plural, able to be extended, able to be changed also because of the nature of those horrendous British procurement systems where other people, other architects, other designers would, be able to get involved without our choice, and actually, so the question was, what do we do in a place that has all this contingency that is going to move it? How do we design something that can actually survive in that kind of context? And if we're just concerned with building form and material completeness, then we're completely screwed. We have no chance at all. So that sort of entanglement is something that means the building, quite literally, as a set of material objects, grew out of that sort of stuff. And it grew out of it not as a kind of defensive posture, but something that was active and engaged and alive and kind of agile, I would say. So that's one way of doing it. The scale of that building now does, I would argue, sort of sit within a set of spaces that are very different, but very relatable to that place. The other building was completely different building. It's a kind of, privately funded building that happens to be ours, that exists in Greece, and it's a very low cost building, it costs 120,000 euros. And I built that with a view to really understanding what a new kind of, I mean, again, I'm kind of dumbing this down, but a new vernacular could look like in a place like that, where I was horrified by the types of things that people were building, because again, they were sort of, imaginary sort of relationships to Venetian sort of architecture that never existed there. And so the second question was, if I am interested in these things, what materials there are, what people there are, what processes there are, how do we draw a building out of those things? What do they have? And so the house we did in the Olive Grove is a building that actually talks about what a new set of, relationships could give rise to that didn't in any way view the local through a kind of nostalgic concern with building form and cultural sort of, symbolism, but more just quite literally culture, people, processes, material. And what I like about the building is that the story of all that is kind of evident in it, and it corrupts the sort of architectural story of setting things out, relationships that are controlled and universal. There's a kind of clash of cultures where people challenge those orthodoxies through them setting out the formwork and the structure and the relationships, all those things that cut right through the kind of conceit of architecture, and show that architecture is a kind of impossible concern when it meets the world. And also it uses things like, rebar and, just unfinished reinforced concrete and, plastic curtains and cable ties that are the real just stuff that you can get from that place without any romance. So to a certain degree, that's two ways that, you can make stuff in a place.
The book's got 8 chapters, and each of them deals with a different aspect of this idea of the locale or localism, or the local, sorry.
mm, mm,
I'm
mm.
quite interested in this tension that is there within this, and you've touched on this already, this idea between the global and the local, and that there is essentially a critique, critique of universalism, as attractive as it is. And part of the tendency of architectural professionalism is towards that. I mean, it's the nature of professional knowledge fundamentally. But these chapters, you sort of break down the local into differing parts. It's not an overarching vision. You know, you've got architecture of accrual as in chapter 8, you've got the locality of urbanism as chapter 5, chapter 3, local cultural identity.
Yeah.
How did you construct this book? I mean, what's the kind of undergirding logic? Did you find that you needed to kind of lever these things apart, or was there a very transparent break?
A little bit. A little bit. I mean, I think that, I mean, curiously, in some ways, I was asked to write a book about materials, local materials, by the RIBA. They emailed me and said, would I be interested in doing this thing? And, it seemed quite simple, although a bit of my mind knew it was actually really, quite complex. And it did coincide with the time where I'd gone back to Mallorca to go and see Candice, which is Jon Utsen's house that he built after working on the Sydney Opera House. He fled from Sydney, went to Mallorca, and it did spark this interest or observation. I mean, kind of incredibly obvious observation that materials are really interesting, but they're never kind of literal. They're always in a way embedded in things that aren't just sort of geological, if you like. There's a sort of all of the culture around them. And why I say geological is that, if you look at the kind of, I was thinking, well, that materials is a book around materials. And so I started thinking about, projects that have an expressively material concern, such as, Flint House. And of course, that building, although, some could argue it's remarkable, isn't really very interesting because of its sort of superficiality. It's kind of material as sort of wallpaper rather than material as something that's embedded in a set of messy, loose, relational kind of networks. And so, what I started to realize is it has no relationship. It's kind of monologue. It's not a dialogue with the place. Whereas buildings that have no material, like at cost, or no local material, are hyper local buildings. So again, it's like Colandre's equivalent 8, where there's a set of fire bricks laid out on the floor in the Tate in whenever it was 1980 or something, and probably, I'm sure I got the date wrong. And the question was, what is it about? Is it about material? Is it about the kind of intent? Is it about the organization of the material? What is this all about? And of course, that then opens you up to a whole kind of complex world of ideas that are constantly kind of shifting. And so then the confusion, I think, was that, well, I'm somebody that's hyper interested in the kind of messy, plural community processes that challenge architectural orthodoxies. The architects are so kind of pious and neat and ordered, and I kind of hate all that stuff. And so of course I've always been interested in those kind of messy, loose projects. However, there's then that realization, well, actually, architects that are really good are, of course, really, really interesting and clever and move beyond those kind of orthodoxies. And Glenn's work, for example, and Gianni Botsford's work, who's another friend, they're really good, clever architects who don't allow themselves to be sort of pigeonholed with, within the sort of straitjacket that is architecture, because they can shift beyond it because they're so good. So Glenn, who is in some ways highly orthodox, he's very interested in much more than I am in the kind of universality of certain sort of logical frameworks of architecture. Actually, his work is so clever because it just is still so direct, so unromantic, and actually so layered in so many levels of taking on these really big themes again that he'll resist being sort of clothed in. They kind of elude him just to making something that in a sense defies categorization. His early buildings, are they architecture, are they sheds? Is he actually clever or just ordinary? Is it architecture or just something that emerged in a new kind of vernacular way? And then Gianni, who is explicitly and self-consciously architectural, again has this interest in the local that he has called adaptation, that shows that you can really millimetrically use architectural ideas to embed buildings in places. So it veers from one extreme to the other within the course of 2 chapters, and then settle down into looking at all those other things that have become sort of part of our discourse since, Kenneth Frampton was writing. The two critical things within that are, ecology and participation, which didn't really exist in the way that we understand them now. And by ecology, I don't really mean, climate change, although of course I do also, because of course, we've had to look at how we use materials because of concerns around the carbon cost of bringing materials from other places. And yet we're stuck because it's unaffordable to use a material from somewhere directly because of the labor in this country. So again, there's this sort of incredible paradox with wanting to be low carbon, wanting to be local, but being unable to. And having to think then, well, if we're going to be local and we want to use materials, we're going to have to use different stuff, which is, Rural Studios bag. We can use just car windscreens and, stuff that we can scavenge. So that is the sort of ecological sort of framing of it that I think is interesting. And then, there's the sort of pedagogical aspect of, them, Rural Studio, and of course the projects at Hook Park and the participatory ones, and so on and so on and so on. So it sort of expands, I hope, things that were relatively sort of static and polarized in 1983 or 1982, whenever it was, when Kenneth Frampton was looking at the universal versus the global through a kind of cultural lens. I think there's a whole set of other things that have emerged, since then.
Sort of to take a sort of critical perspective, I suspect from the outside that some of the examples, so your book is obviously illustrated with case studies from around the world that have relevance and pertinence to your general discussions, your thematic discussion. Part of me wonders whether some of this kind of situated, localized practice, and I'm not talking about Invisible Studio, your work here, and I'm not talking about Mercut, but certainly some of these other practices, some of whom you've mentioned, tend to, in my eyes, or through one particular critical way of looking at it, somewhat over-romanticize the lack of access to materials. So they're making, in a way, not a virtue of the inaccessibility of adequate materials or professional materials, but rather they are luxuriating in the awkwardness of it.
Yeah.
And that kind of, for me, comes
that's probably true.
But it comes back to me for your anxiety or your awkwardness about the vernacular, which is that there's a certain fetishization that seems to go alongside this attempt at the local. How does an architect avoid that? Because I don't think your work does at all, and obviously others you've mentioned doesn't. But it's a tricky one, isn't it? It's a fine balancing act.
Sure. I mean, I think that yes, there's the fetishization around stuff, and there's the kind of, in a way, scarcity porn, if you like, that is a kind of tendency, and I think it isn't necessarily the whole answer, but I do think that participation is hyper interesting for so many reasons, in that it allows us to go beyond the kind of lone auteur, conception of something that is really considered in terms of its sort of artifact status. And when we're working with groups of people, we conceive things that have to emerge through a kind of tussle, that we can't fetishize those objects, those artifacts, that stuff, that material in a way that, they are fetishized in many of the projects, whether they're Flint House or something that's, made out of a kind of accrual of things in a, collaged manner. And so I think that the best projects in the book, and I would include sort of Assemble's work in that, or even Rural Studios work in that. I think that the Rural Studio, just look at kind of what there is, and there's a sort of collision of stuff that happens because lots of people are working on them. They're experiments in themselves, and it's sort of reclaiming architecture as a loose and messy, contingent, relational, social process that doesn't have to be this sort of high-minded, important act. Doesn't mean it isn't important, but it's not necessarily framed as something that's going to be important. And in all other disciplines that, are creative ones, whether it's music or writing or food or, whatever it is, we do those things as a matter of course. There's the kind of both and in architecture, there's only the kind of, there's the one. Architecture is a high-minded process, and it has a boundary around it with all sorts of other ways of doing things that aren't lone auteur, are not architecture. And yet, the tiny amount of buildings that are designed by architects in the world, and it's a kind of astonishing how little we care about as architects all of the other ways of making buildings that really are architecture. And I'm guilty of this. And I remember last year, I started, with my master's students, asking them, about bits of architecture that they thought were interesting. And of course, by doing that, I'm referring them to the body of work that exists within a very narrow definition of architecture. So I actually don't think the word architecture is very useful, because there's only built stuff. And if we open the edges of architecture to include all sorts of other ways of making things, architecture just becomes more inclusive, more expressive, more interesting, more engaged, more experimental, more, process led rather than about the kind of product and the object. And I think, my plea is that we don't necessarily retreat from architecture, but we kind of re-engage with things that architecture has kind of banished from its world around us. And in a way, I would argue that we need to be asking not what we should build, but put in place a set of processes that allow us to think, who am I going to do this with, and from what, and why, and how, not the what question.
I think that's a very elegant way of putting it. One last question, which is around this idea of restless innovation. Where does this happen within the work? It's a beautiful phrase. I think it's a really elegant phrase. And I suppose there's two areas I would like to think about it. For practitioners, perhaps it's too late, but when we were speaking before we were recording, you moved more fully now into the realm of academia. How do we kind of teach this form of restless innovation? How do we teach these ideas in the little time that we get in this design studio?
It's a very interesting question. And of course I can't answer that completely, but I think that I think Jeremy Till, of course, tells us that radical making isn't radical thinking. And of course, for so long, restless innovation means, Thomas Heatherwick or, big, and of course, that's not innovation. It's not even radical. It's like, I remember even when I was at the AA making buildings, the critic came and they're like, why are you so conservative? Why are you just making buildings that sit within the processes of architecture that we're all familiar with? Why are you framing it in those same old concerns? So I think some of the restless innovation it's not to be with material processes and, the configuration of, materials and the way they manifest in different shapes, of course. And of course, this, Ambrose. It's much more to do with exploding the kind of the world, the very, very, very conservative and limiting worlds of architecture. That doesn't mean architecture is not interesting, because I have prefaced all of this by saying architecture is endlessly interesting because it's such a big thing and such a complex discipline and so layered and takes on so many things. However, architecture with a capital A and a little boundary around it doesn't engage with those things. It just engages with the thing, the material object. And if we stop worrying about the kind of culture of architecture, just have sort of wider conversations, which, we've talked before about Bruno Latour, he would argue the same thing, that, these sort of hybrids that exist, architecture and the rest of the world, are where architecture needs to go to innovate, not in the reconfiguration of the thing or, in the way that the built environment needs to innovate to make buildings more efficiently. It's to do with the sort of conversation with the local that can be kind of reimagined, I think.
It's a great point to finish on. Piers, that was wonderful. Thank you so very much.
Good. Thank you, Ambrose.
To enrich the earth, I have sowed clover and grass to grow and die. I have ploughed in the seeds of winter grains and various legumes, their growth to be ploughed in to enrich the earth. I have stirred into the ground the offal and the decay of the growth of past seasons, and so mended the earth and made its yield increase. That's half of Enriching the Earth by Wendell Berry, and it's proper lovely, and I think about things vernacular. Thanks to Piers for speaking with me. It's an enormous joy, and for the book too. See the podcast description for links to the book and to Piers at Work and Play. And thanks for listening.